So I came back in July of 1981. I came back south from Arctic Bay, and the initial piece of work that I had to do was some of the archival research to sort of match up to what I had found or done in Arctic Bay itself. So I went to the Hudson's Bay Company archives. I went through the records that are available at the Hudson's Bay Company archives. I went to Ottawa. In those days, getting material out of the National Archives was much easier if you could find it, and it was not redacted. So you actually got the names and the disc numbers of people. So I tried to dig up everything I could find out about in Arctic Bay. That was when, although there's been other stuff done with this since, when I found out that in fact the RCMP had sent a duplicate copy of all of their patrol reports to Indian Affairs, and while you couldn't get them out of the RCMP, you could get them out of Indian Affairs. So reading through all that material, I mean, and it's wonderful if you look at, say, those RCMP patrol reports. These guys in the 30s and 40s are traveling around North Baffin Island from Pond Inlet down to Igloolik, even further down to Nauyat, back up to Arctic Bay. They're traveling around. They're visiting all the camps. They're talking about all the people who were in the camps. They're talking about the conditions in those camps. So it's quite remarkable material when you read through it, and it really gives you a sense, a very clear sense of where people are, what they're doing, what the conditions are at the time. It was incredible material. And then the other one that I read was slightly more accidental, but I found out that the Anglican Church Archives had Jack Turner's diaries, and Jack Turner was the missionary there from 1928 to 1946, off and on because of some leaves and stuff. But he had actually moved his mission post over to Siralik, which is in Moffat Inlet, which is about halfway down Admiralty Inlet. So he'd actually moved into the Arctic Bay area in 1936. And so he was there throughout the 30s and 40s. And again, his diaries were an incredibly good record of who was where doing what, which is what I was reading them for at the time. I wasn't reading them for the sort of history of missions or the other kind of thing that later became of interest. I was purely reading them to work with the HBC, the RCMP material on sort of tracking where people had been over time and where people had lived over time. And in the process, a number of other things came out in reading those diaries, but they were quite something to read. I'll just, as a bracket, note that that's also where and how I met my wife. My current wife was originally the archivist at the Anglican Church, so that's where I met her. But so I read through all of Jack Turner's diaries and got quite an interesting picture, at least initially, about what his take on it was and what the history of the missions were. But that was sort of the historical background material that I was trying to get from my thesis. But my problem in writing the thesis was, okay, so you've come to the realization that this whole thing has to depart from names. That's all very well. At that time, the only other person who'd written on that was Bernard Saladin d'Anglure. He'd written that paper on northern Quebec and names in northern Quebec. But there was really nothing else at the time. So if that's your point of departure, well, that's all very well. I mean, it's not too bad to write the initial chapters, which are on the kind of the technicalities of the transmission of the names. That was not hard to write. But when you sit back and you begin to say, so what is this all about? Why are they doing this? What does it mean? That was much more difficult to start thinking about. Certainly I had been trained by David Turner and, having read people like Needham and all of that kind of stuff that we don't have to make any kind of assumption about it referring to any kind of genealogical grid. I mean, that's relevant to a point, but it's not what the story is about. But that it does articulate relations in some kind of way. So the question becomes, well, what relations are being articulated by this naming system? What's it doing? That was way more difficult because I really, I knew and I could explain and I could show how it influenced the kinship terminology. I mean, the easiest example is that Elizabeth Allalu's last husband was Peter Allalu, and Peter Allalu had died about 2 years before I had gone north. And there were about 11 kids in Arctic Bay named after Peter Allalu, and I was taught by the Inuit to call all of them a tata. So I got all these 2-year-olds that I call a tata. And there was a thing which doesn't often come out in the literature, is that there's usually one person who is named who seems to be more emphasized than the others. So in this case, it was my sister's child, Suyuk's child. Suyuk is my sister's husband. And like he was taught, whenever I would go over to visit, he was taught that Suyuk would say to him, Irni Kutadli now, where's your tall son? And he would learn to point at me. And of course I had to give him gifts, candy and other kinds of things and diapers. So I mean, I had got a grasp on that, and I knew how that worked, and that was reported in the literature. But even so, what kind of relationships is this articulating? The clues began to come together in a couple of pieces. I think the first one was when I was doing the legwork of actually collecting the names. I was actually talking to Elizabeth. I was talking to my mother, and it was about one of her adopted grandchildren. And I said, so what's her name? And she said to me, Puksimat. Now, Puksimat, by then I knew that there was no Puksimats anywhere in the genealogies. I hadn't seen that name anywhere. And so I said to her, Puksimat. I said, where did Puksimat come from? And she said, oh, from an old man who died in Greenland. I said, well, why are you giving this child a name from an old man in Greenland? Well, that led into this whole story, the whole Katlakswak story, the one that Father Mary has so well, recorded. That led to that entire story, and about how a long, long time ago, 1865 as it turns out, a long, long time ago, a group of Inuit had left the North Baffin region, traveled over Devon Island, Ellesmere Island, over to Qaanaaq in Greenland, and then they had not returned. Now, and as Father Mary points out, in that process, some of the names were passed on, and some of them were lost. Some of them ended up being lost to Greenland. Puksimat was actually one of those names that had been lost. And so when, through Father Mary's and Ken Harper's efforts, they made the connections between Qaanaaq and North Baffin Island, Arctic Bay and Pond Inlet, and there were exchanges back and forth. One of the things that this old man in Greenland said to the people from Arctic Bay is, when I die, I want my name to return to its proper land. So will you name a child after me so that my name can return to its proper land? And that's the story that Elizabeth told me. And I thought, proper land? Like, okay, why does it have to come back to its proper land? So that was sort of, filed in the back of the head. One of the other experiences that I had is I traveled, the story of this trip is quite hilarious, but I traveled with a bunch of Inuit guys from Arctic Bay to Pond Inlet. We went by Skidoo on the land crossing to Pond Inlet, and spent a couple of weeks in Pond Inlet hanging out with the folks in Pond and with my friends from Arctic Bay. One of the things I found when I was in Pond was, they'd be saying to us, how's so-and-so back in Arctic Bay, how's, and I didn't recognize any of the names. Like, I said to my friends from Arctic Bay, who are we talking about? And they said, oh, well, so-and-so. Okay, well, isn't that his name? Yeah. But the people in Pond Inlet always call him by this. Well, wait a minute. Why are we getting different names when we're in different locations? And then as it happened, Mary made a trip down to Igloolik and noticed the same thing in Igloolik. The people in Igloolik were using different names to talk about the people in Arctic Bay. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. This is actually getting quite confusing now. What's going on here? So there were those couple of pieces of information that began to say to me, no, there's something else going on here. There's some connection. One of the other things which I noticed, and I actually don't know if anybody's talked about this much in the literature, but Inuit who are born on the land are extremely emotional and sentimental about the place where they were born. And it's not just the camp where they are born. It's the square meter on the ground where their mother was kneeling or squatting or whatever when they actually gave birth to them. Like, I've seen this a number of times where I'm out in camp with Inuit, and we come to a place, and they get absolutely rhapsodic about, isn't this the most beautiful place in the world you've ever been? No, it looks like a clay beach of mud to me, but, this is the most beautiful place in the whole wide world. And then they get, literally say, this is where our hamak was. This is where my mother was when she gave birth to me. Incredibly emotional connection. And like I said, I don't know if anybody else has ever written about that. But it struck me quite a number of times about that. And it's not the same kind of emotional connection that I think we have to our birthplaces, but it was very, very profound. And I realized that one of the things about that is that these places, these spaces, were the place where a particular name became embodied once again, became incarnated once again. And so it was a focus on that connection between the name coming back into human life again. And that really connected for me, again, in the broader anthropological reading, when you read the accounts from Boaz. Bernard has done a lot of work on this since, but the accounts of the Tivayut, where everybody lines up from the oldest to the youngest, men on one side, women on the other, probably the other way around actually, men on one side, women on the other, and they start with the oldest, and they call out their name and where they were born, down all the way down the row, and then the shaman matches them off. So there is some really important connection between the names and the place where people are born. All right, that Inuit are carrying forward, and what little we know about the Tivayut and what's going on there. There are all kinds of issues around that, but just that little connection to me is incredibly important. And so I thought, okay, in beginning to think about this, there's some kind of fundamental connection between the names and the land. How does that work? What is that all about? And is this in fact really what's going on here? Is a kind of discourse, or a way of talking about the ongoing relationship of people to the land, right? So the first thing I had to kind of get into my head was, I did an experiment, and maybe somebody could argue about whether it really worked or not, but I had been able to collect not only the data on the names in Arctic Bay, but I was able to get the we won't say how I got it, the census data on Igloolik, Arctic Bay, and Pond Inlet, which had most of their names, most people's names in there, and I was actually familiar with a good many of them anyways. And I did that kind of distribution analysis of which names occurred where the frequency of the names were occurring. And I I noticed that there were some names that seemed to be quite unique to Arctic Bay, some names that were quite unique to Pond Inlet, some were quite unique to Igloolik. There were names that were shared. If you think of it, a triangle each way, they were shared, and some names that were shared amongst all three. And part of that, and you can account for it historically by people moving around and dying and being born in different places. That accounts for a good bit of it. But what I began to realize is that the different names that I was getting in Arctic Bay, Pond Inlet, at least when I traveled to Pond Inlet and when Mary went to Igloolik, the different names reflected the relationships of that person in Pond Inlet as opposed to the relationships of that person in Arctic Bay. And so there was kind of a double layer of names, if you can think of it this way. There were names that were quite specific to each area, and people would usually have one or two of those. There were other names which were quite generic across the entire region. Kunu, for example, was a name that occurs all over North Baffin Island. It's kind of like Smith in North Baffin Island, it's just everywhere. And if you looked at the names, people seemed to have some quite specific names, but they also seemed to have a couple of general names as well. People tended to have 3 or 4 names. Not always, but tended to. So I realized that the names located people very specifically within each area, and that when you were in Igloolik, you used that person's Igloolik name to locate them within the social context of Igloolik, as opposed to the social context of Arctic Bay. What that began to make me realize is that if you sort of flip your way of thinking about it, and I'm not the first person to say this, but if you think about it, that it's not that people acquire certain names, but that over time, various bodies move through the same name. And because of the notion that this is the previous person who died, who's reincarnated, you have to be careful on the use of reincarnated there, but because this is the person that's reincarnated in this body, that there are different bodies that fill in with each name. So the effect is that you get this kind of, and the way I think of it is this kind of grid of names over the land. It's not actually a grid, but this kind of layering of names over the land. And as people move about, they plug into the node in the grid, so to speak, through the names, so that it automatically creates a set of relationships for you as you move about. It has the other kind of interesting effect if you think about this, and if you think about all of the stuff on hunters and gatherers and mobility of hunters and gatherers and all of that. It has the interesting effect that it makes it look like the same people have been there forever, because the same names are always there. Different bodies, different people, and people, as we know with Inuit, are highly mobile, and they're moving around all over the place all the time for the very pragmatic ecological reasons that you get in the north. But because the names are this kind of permanent abstract layer over the land, it looks like nobody's ever moved ever. Okay? And there's this incredible sense of continuity which takes you back in time. And in fact, I would suggest to you that, I don't know if I had this conversation with Frédéric, but I know I had it with Xavier Blaisel. I would suggest to you that that's in fact what's going on the Devaluat, is that they're actually reproducing those names over time, literally reproducing them. That's why they're pairing people up afterwards for a night of sexual relations. So what I began to realize that in fact the emphasis on the names, the emphasis on the relationships that come through the names, seeks to perpetuate and reproduce sets of social relationships over the land. And so it creates that kind of neat tie between people and the land. I mean, the question always is, how do people connect to the land? How does land ownership work? Huge problem when you deal with all of the literature around, northern Algonquins. But in this case, there seemed to be a very, very clear, precise connection, and that it was done through the naming system. And in fact, as in my reading of it, that's what the naming system was all about. And in fact, that's what, the kinship system, if you want to use that word, was all about, was in fact, through the names, reproducing and reconnecting people over time over the land, and reestablishing those social relationships. That was that conclusion, and that's basically what my doctorate says in more words. But that's basically what it argues. I also looked at, I did a couple of exercises in my thesis where I looked at, took a name and followed the bodies who'd occupied that name in Arctic Bay, tracked through that particular name to see how the name remained permanent. The one that I chose was Atagutiak. The interesting thing about Atagutiak is that, in fact, in that particular case, it wasn't that people had died and the name had been passed on, but it was that people had moved away. And what I found fascinating was within a year, another Atagutiak has moved in. And just had replaced the previous Atagutiak. Now, of course, the Atagutiak that I knew had been there for, at that time, 35 years, so he'd been there for a long time. But so it wasn't a matter of transmitting the name from one generation to the next in that particular case study. It was rather that every time the name moved away, so to speak, somebody else moved in to reoccupy that space, which I thought was really an interesting point. So how do you account for that? So it was a matter of tracking some of those things over time, and again, that was one of the pieces of the argument that was in there. So I ended up, how do I say this? I ended up at the end of this argument. Well, as I said, that's basically my argument. But I'm in a very different position from where I started out with David Turner and this idea of co-production and co-residential relationships. That's all gone out the window now. And so, I mean, as David quite jokingly says, I was probably his only graduate student who ever fundamentally critiqued him and disagreed with him, but did it in a way that comes out of the kind of theoretical assumptions that he had developed. But basically he said, well, whatever this may be for the Cree and for the Anishinaabe, that's not what's going on with the Inuit. Something totally different is going on with the Inuit, and we need to think about that. What does that mean? And so it took me in a very, very different direction, and to very, very different conclusions from the kind of thing that David was talking about. And this is where things get kind of interesting, at least in sort of thinking about the Inuit material. When I said that the names occupy a particular land, occupy a particular space, and bodies flow through the names, I was thinking, okay, where else that I can think of? Where else do I know that this happens? Well, the best comparative case is actually the chiefs on the West Coast. If you think about it, the chief system on the West Coast, the way those names are first of all passed on through the potlatch system, but what's going on is that the names are permanent. They're permanently attached to the houses. They're permanently attached to pieces of land and fishing territories and all that sort of stuff, and yet bodies flow through them. Okay, over time, various bodies flow through them. So all of a sudden, my comparative matrix is shifting to thinking, well, maybe I should have a little closer look at what's going on the West Coast here, because that's providing, some models for how to think about this space. Now, of course, there's no chief system amongst the Inuit. There's nothing as elaborate and as fixed as that. But there is this notion that there is a permanency here. So that was sort of one. And the other thing about it is that one of the effects that the names has, and this happens also on the West Coast, is that they're not actually lineal systems. Okay, so they're not patrilineal or matrilineal or anything like that. But how do we put it? They tend towards that, because the easiest way to pass the names would be through various, existing family links. That doesn't happen with the Inuit. It does more on the West Coast. But you're getting a push towards lineality here. That's not exactly the kind of lineality that we usually talk about, right? Something that you see also, flip the other direction, you see also amongst the Anishinaabe with their totems. There's a push towards lineality there, but there's something else going on at the same time. So anyways, in trying to think about it, and it's actually an article that I wrote on cannibalism. One of my most insane articles that I've ever written in my entire life. And thank God it's published in such an obscure Italian literary journal that nobody ever finds it, unless I give you a copy of it. But in there it started with the simple observation that there's this huge discourse around cannibalism amongst the Cree, but at least in the mythology with the Wetiko and all of that sort of stuff. But you don't get that amongst the Inuit. There's lots of stories about actual cannibal events, and we have a huge record of those. But there's very, very little in the mythology, in the stories, in the traditional stories, right? And so I kind of asked the question to myself: why are these inverted? Why are they opposite to each other? And my answer was, I'm not going to get into the whole argument, but my answer was because fundamentally the Inuit are not incorporative. Remember we talked about the idea of incorporative before? And David pointed out that one of the best metaphors for incorporation is cannibalism, to eat the other person, to take the other person literally inside of you. That's a fabulous metaphor. But I argued that in fact the Inuit are not fundamentally incorporative, because you get your name and your identity comes from your name, and you hold that identity to the end of your life. And it doesn't matter if you get married. It doesn't matter if you move to another social group. It doesn't matter. You still maintain that identity. And so when husband and wives join together amongst Inuit, they don't incorporate to form a new social group. They maintain those relationships that they had through their names, and they kind of double up their relationships by marrying somebody else. That's, in terms of the kind of thing that David was talking about, and in terms of thinking about social organization, that is, if I can say, way off the cliff from what anybody else was suggesting. Because everybody else historically has always lumped the Inuit in with the Cree, the Anishinaabe, and said, well, they're all the same kinds of organizations. And I'm saying no, actually, there is a fundamental difference here. It doesn't take us to the Australian Aborigines. It's not there. But it's not this incorporative model at the same time. And in fact, my conclusion on that was that there is a level of incorporation, and that's where I'm going to talk about the igloo later on. That the igloo, in fact, represents a level whereby different units come together and form a single unit. But that, in fact, in my mind, the dialectic, and I mean that word very seriously, the dialectic of Inuit society is a contradiction between this kind of linearity non-incorporation that takes place with the names and the kind of joining together to form a single group in the igloo. That in fact creates the dynamism of Inuit social life. And to me, that's the heart of what is going on. So that's gone beyond my thesis, by the way. None of that's in my thesis. But that's the way I came to think about it. And it's a very, very different understanding from what most other people have had. But that's where I came to. So